Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where you can learn about where the power lies in your organization and where you can power yourself up towards the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. The main objective of this lesson is to reflect on how projects and organizations operate. Although the principles within the project management knowledge areas and processes apply to projects across all organizations, they are not likely to be executed in exactly the same manner on different projects, let alone in different organizations. So in this lesson, we ask and answer questions such as: why do organizations execute projects at all? How does an organizational structure affect project governance? What is organizational culture? How does an organization's communication style affect a project? How are projects aligned within the organization? Who has the power in the organization? And how does that affect a project? And what is the project lifecycle? To better understand how to best carry out your own projects in your own organizations, it's important to seek answers to these questions and understand patterns and differences on how other projects and other organizations function. The main concept of this lesson is that projects do not operate in a vacuum. They function within the context of an organization. Most organizations execute projects and use projects as a way to fulfill on their organizational objectives. A project team operates within the organization in which it belongs. Apart from that, it is also likely to have interactions outside the organization, to customers, sellers, agencies, the government, and so on. And it's possible to have project teams with members belonging to different organizations. Organizations are unique, but more or less fall within three types of operational models. They also have different cultures and styles. The organizational culture and styles shape the experience of dealing with or belonging to and executing projects within that organization. It's important for us project managers to have awareness of the different organizational models and cultures and styles so that we can adjust our behavior. In other words, make the best use of any advantages and handle negatives when carrying out our own projects. So let's start from the beginning. Why do organizations execute projects at all? We know they execute projects. That's why you're watching this and why you're aiming to take your PMP exam. An article in an academic journal even goes further to say that there has been an increase in project orientation within different organizations. The author, in his review of the literature, found four main reasons. Namely, the first one is organizations execute projects in order to quickly answer to market changes. In order to remain competitive, organizations want to be first, or if not first, then at least early to market with their innovations. Second, in order to develop new products or services. In order to create something new, it may mean pulling resources across the organization who have the special skills and knowledge required. The team works together on the project, but then once completed, they often go back to their own home departments. Third, projects are a means to minimize destabilization in an organization. If a change is coming, a project can be a means to soften the impact of the change. For example, with a pilot project to introduce a new technology organization. A project is a way that allows some parts of the organization to be more independent and cut through layers of management. And then finally, fourth is the desire to transfer to projects what is considered the non-routine activities like project planning, integration, enable constant reporting, and so on. So others who are not on projects can focus on the routine, day-to-day tasks and keep the lights on in the organization. So how then does an organization influence how projects are run? It does so in many ways. For one, the organization provides a set of enterprise environmental factors under which the project must operate. The PMBOK guide describes an enterprise environmental factor, or EEF, as conditions not under the immediate control of the team that influence, constrain, or direct the project, program, or portfolio. So, for example, the organizational culture and the organizational structure are factors which influence the project. Most projects would have little influence over changing them, so the project team will have to try and succeed within the existing culture and within the existing structure. Other givens on a project are the organizational process assets, and the PMBOK guide describes these organizational process assets, these OPAs, as plans, processes, policies, procedures, and knowledge bases that are specific to and used by the performing organization. The PMBOK guide groups these assets into two categories. First, processes and procedures. You should consider the both tangible and non-tangible assets of an organization. So there may be a 100-page policy guide, but it could also be a common practice or part of a collective knowledge that may not be written down. The other category is corporate knowledge bases. This is part of the intellectual assets which can be used for your projects, such as financial databases and lessons learned. Wikipedia describes organizational culture as the behavior of humans who are part of an organization and the meanings that the people attach to their actions. Organizational culture affects the way that the project team interacts inside and outside the team, with customers and with stakeholders. If you were asked, how would you describe your organizational culture? Although you may use the term organizational culture sometimes, it's hard to answer or put into words what the collective climate and pulse of an organization is all about. With globalization, when we think of culture, what does come to mind is the diversity among people of differing national origins. But organizational culture may be related to that, but it's not quite that culture that we really seek. Luckily for us, researchers such as the psychologist Dr. Geert Hofstede have pondered such questions, and in the 1970s he created a model of 6 dimensions of organizational culture, which have since been further developed by other researchers. There's no need for you to memorize these dimensions that you'll see in the next 6 slides, but for each dimension we suggest that you reflect on how your organization does it. How does this dimension of the organizational culture affect how you go about doing your projects? The first dimension is process-oriented versus results-oriented. This relates to whether the organization emphasizes the means, processes, or in other words, how you get to a goal on the left, versus prioritizing the achievement, the desired result on the right. For this review here on these organizational dimensions, imagine a continuum where on each end are the descriptions on the arrow. An organization can be at any point in this range. So, for example, one organization can be extremely process-oriented towards the left, and another can be at the other end of the spectrum and is very results-oriented. Yet a third organization might be more balanced or in the middle, where they place equal importance on process as well as results. This goes for this dimension as well as for the upcoming 5. Our second dimension is job-oriented versus employee-oriented. This relates to whether management philosophy is oriented towards job performance or the employees. In a job-oriented culture, the task performance is tantamount, possibly at the expense of the employee's well-being, whereas in an employee-oriented culture, the overall well-being of the employee comes first. The sense of an identity that an employee has is embodied in the dimension where we compare professional orientation versus parochial orientation. So for professional, here we're talking about the degrees and certifications and content of the job that a person is executed, or the profession that they have, that we strongly identify with. While on the other side, on the parochial side, an employee relies on the organization's clout or the prestige of the function that she or he executes that determines professional identity. Our next dimension is open systems versus closed systems, and this relates to internal and external communication. It is much easier to be welcomed or integrated into an open culture than a closed one, which is more wary of outsiders or newcomers. Tight control versus loose control is next, and this relates to the level of importance of formality. This might be a bit stereotypical, but let's compare a bank versus an advertising agency. For a bank, we think of formality, cost consciousness, punctuality and seriousness when it comes to the cultural atmosphere, whereas in the advertising agency we're more thinking of an easygoing culture that is somewhat even unpredictable. And finally, we have the dimension of pragmatic versus normative. This relates to how an organization deals with the environment, particularly with customers. Where a sales and service organization may be more flexible and market-driven in a pragmatic culture, but in a normative one, quite the opposite, as it's rigid and ideological, likely at the expense of the customer. How did this review work as an exercise for you? What are the implications of culture? Is working on a project for your organization more like a walk in the park on a nice sunny day, or is it more like going through a treacherous storm? Take these 6 dimensions and think them through with your own organization, with your own culture in mind. Use the culture that surrounds you to get to the finish line and succeed on your projects. But be wary. In most cases, you don't want to be on the extreme of an organizational culture dimension. For example, in pragmatic versus rigid. You want employees to have a healthy respect for rules and regulations, but unreasonably rigid and overly elaborate sets of rules, they cause frustration and dissatisfaction for employees and customers. Through every process, you have to be aware and work with what you have in terms of culture. For example, getting support of team members for onboarding a new staff member should be easy in an open system culture. On the flip side, for example, plan on more resources and time in your estimate when you have an uphill battle against a negative or difficult culture. For example, count on more time spent on stakeholder management and communication in a closed system culture. Communication is critical on any project. This includes communication among team members, with stakeholders and customers or suppliers. With the advent of new technologies, a project has many options in terms of how to best communicate. There is in-person communication, phones and faxes, but nowadays, well, unfortunately, there's also email, texting between cell phones or short message systems, and video web conferencing technologies which allow for more effective communications in virtual teams. What form of communication, as well as the norms and nuances of both formal and informal communication you use, is dependent on the organization's communication style. What is acceptable in one culture might be interpreted as rude or disrespectful in another. Next, we move on to the question of how projects are aligned within the organization. There are different organizational models, each with their corresponding strengths and weaknesses, and you as the project manager must learn to balance the need of the project with the need of the organization. First, we have the functional organization, and the PMBOK guide defines this as a hierarchical organization where each employee has one clear superior, like we see here in this example, and staff are grouped by areas of specialization and managed by a person with expertise in that area. So you can see on this chart how each department runs its own projects. It's hierarchical, where the staff reports to the head of their departments, and departments are organized by function or skill, like finance and accounting, human resources, engineering, and sales. Each organizational structure has advantages and disadvantages. Let's take a look at those for our functional organization, beginning with the advantages. A project works well within a functional organization when the project content or subject matter lies within the expertise of that function. So if the organization has an engineering project, it makes sense to run the project within the engineering department. Organizationally, there's little change as projects are still run within the existing functional organization. Department or functional heads have the flexibility and power to pull resources to do projects and then return them to their normal work. And for a staff member, the line of authority is clear, as the functional or department manager to whom they report has the power and influence. The functional manager also controls the budget. As to the disadvantages, departments or functions can become quite siloed. For a project, other expertise outside the function may be required. When you need new talent across the organization, the functional style may not work so well. As resources for the project may not be dedicated full-time, they may still have their routine or daily work to complete. It may be hard to balance and incorporate or prioritize project work. As a result, project progress may be slow, as resources may have to focus on their daily work over their project work. Remember, there is a minimal project management oversight role. She or he is more of a project coordinator and expediter and exercises very little power over project decisions. We are moving on to the projectized organization, and as you can see in this diagram here, the organization is aligned and managed by project. So each of the departments that you see here really is a project on its own. The projectized organization is defined by the PMBOK guide as any organizational structure in which the project manager has full authority to assign priorities, apply resources, and direct the work of persons assigned to the project. When it comes to the pros and cons of the projectized structure, then on the advantage side, we of course have the fact that the project manager has clear authority over project resources. He or she manages the project budget. There are easier lines of communication as project members are assigned to projects full-time. It's usually easier to communicate with the team. For the same reason, team members are more likely to be more cohesive and they can focus on the project work. For this reason, the project can progress faster than projects run under a functional model. You can create a cross-functional team where no other department dominates in terms of the content or subject matter. On the other side, for the disadvantages, there is project isolation or projectitis. Since there is a unique environment or mini-culture created within the project, this may lead to a strong attachment to the project. With this project isolation, there can be a mentality of we, the project, versus they, the rest of the organization. Some duplication will be there in terms of efforts across projects with the main organization. For example, there is an additional layer of management in the form of the project manager. And after the project is done, team members may have difficulty getting reassigned. Unlike a project run within a functional organization, they don't really have a routine day-to-day job that they can return back to. And then, of course, there is the matrix organization. Matrix organizations, those are any organizational structures in which the project managers share responsibility with the functional managers for assigning priorities and for directing the work of persons assigned to the project. This is a hybrid of the functional and the projectized model, where we have a pool of resources which are all managed both by the functional manager and the project manager. As you can see here, what we have highlighted in blue, this is one project who will have staff, but the staff also reports back to their particular head of the department or the functional manager. And then in pink we have another project which uses another set of resources from the shared pool. So you can imagine that the people in the blue or pink area, those are the blue and the pink project, that's what they work on for the project work, but at the same time they continue to work in their functional department. The matrix organization is further classified according to power and influence of the project manager as opposed to the functional manager. A strong matrix is more akin to the projectized model where the project manager has more power and influence. That's why we put that in green here, because a strong matrix organization, that's good for us, project managers. However, on the other end of this spectrum in red, we have the weak matrix organization. Well, this is closer to the functional organization. The project manager role is more that of a coordinator, an expediter, and therefore we do not really have all that much power. And then somewhere in between these two is the balanced matrix. This is where we do have a project manager, but he or she does not have full authority and not full-time staff. The matrixed organization has quite a few advantages. For example, sharing resources. Projects are efficient in terms of the ability to share resources. Individuals can be chosen according to the needs of the project. The use of a diverse project team creates a team that is dynamic and able to view problems in a different way as specialists have been brought together in a new environment. They increase project focus. Compare this to the functional organization. There is simply more focus here on the project. Project managers are directly responsible for completing the project within a specific deadline and budget. And it's easier in teams of team member reassignment, as there is a greater tie to the functional organization versus the projectized organization. A team member may be more easily reassigned after the project is finished. Some criticisms raised against the matrix structure, on the other hand, they include a tendency towards anarchy, confusion as to who is the boss and to whom does the staff really feel responsible to. There could be power struggles. A matrix structure encourages managers to compete for power, and a matrix may cause difficulty in group decision-making. It may also be that the matrix structure is created in a rapid growth phase of the organization, but then it's disbanded when the economy goes south. Organizations move to and away from the matrix as it becomes a scapegoat for the failures of the projects. And related to being a scapegoat is excessive overhead. Matrix organizations are indeed blamed for having excessive overhead. So you can see that even the matrix structure, which is the hybrid of the functional and projectized structures, you get a bit of the best of both worlds, but it's not without its issues. An organization does not have to restrict itself to one pattern. It's possible for organizations to have a composite structure, especially large ones, to have a mixture of elements of functional, matrix, and projectized in handling projects and staff. This allows for more effective use of resources, for example in regards to staff and management, and it also allows for flexibility in terms of handling requirements and situations in different areas of the business. So, for example, an organization can primarily be projectized, but then allow for small projects to be run within functional departments. Let's take a look at who has the power and influence in staffing under the three major types of organizational structures. First of all, in a functional organization, the project coordinator or expediter needs to check with the functional manager for staff availability. In the matrixed organization, typically staff is pulled from a pool of resources which are shared across projects. In balanced matrix teams, the functional and project manager have to come to an agreement about staffing availability, and the project manager supervises the staff who is assigned to the project full-time in the projectized organization. So we can conclude that in the functional organization, as the name implies, the functional manager has the power and influence on the staffing decision. In the projectized structure, it's the project manager who has a lot of sway, and in the matrix organization, well, it's somewhere in between, depending on whether it is a strong, weak, or balanced matrix. A project may interact with strategic, middle, and operational levels, which is dependent on such factors like how important a project is. Larger, more strategic projects would tend to gain the attention of those higher up the management chain. Project governance and communication policies are also a factor. Some organizations may require the interaction to adhere to project governance requirements, and the level of maturity and expertise in project management methodology would also affect culture and interaction with management. If other layers of management have strong influence on the project, then the project is impacted in terms of power of the project manager and the role of the project manager. In an extreme case, the project manager may in reality have less power in terms of the project's budget or choice of project team staff. And finally, let's briefly take a look at the generic project lifecycle. According to the PMBOK guide, the project lifecycle refers to the series of phases that a project passes through from its initiation to its closure. So a project lifecycle would include initiating the project, planning and organizing it, then carrying out and executing the work on the project, and finally closing the project. So we have four major phases or stages here for the project as a whole from start to finish. Now, don't make the mistake and start comparing this to the project management process groups that you'll also find in the PMBOK guide. This generic project lifecycle here, initiating, planning, carry out, and closing, is what happens to the project as a whole, from the first minute we work on it to the last minute we work on it. The process groups, on the other hand, which are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing, they are repeated again and again throughout each phase of your overall project. So, as you go through the project life cycle and you are in the initiating phase of your project, you will apply those 5 process groups, because initiating starts and ends at some point. Planning starts and ends at some point. So on the high level, sort of as an umbrella, we have the project life cycle, these 4 major stages here, and then underneath it we apply the 5 process groups to each of these 4 stages. Let's review. In this lesson we covered reasons why organizations execute projects and how organizations influence projects through enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Organizational communicational styles, they will affect your project communications, and you have to use the organizational culture that you're embedded in to your best advantage and make your project succeed. You should also plan and prepare to deal with any negative aspects of an organization's culture, and we described the functional, projectized and matrix structure of running a project with their pros and their cons. And then, of course, the project has to work within the corresponding power structure. The project manager may have more or less or shared influence relative to the functional manager, depending on how the project is organized. And as we have just seen on the previous slide, projects have a life cycle that they go through, initiating, planning, carrying out and executing the work, and then finally closing the project. Before we go, here's a quick exam tip for you to show you how to use what you've learned in this lesson for your studies. A common topic on PMP exam sample question relates to the different organizational structures. On these questions, you may be shown a diagram and you're asked to select if what is depicted is a functional, projectized, strong or weak matrix organization. So you need to understand who yields the power or influence in each structure as well, because that is also a focus on these questions. However, we go through organizational culture dimensions in this overview to strengthen your understanding of organizations and projects. But as you may know from reading the PMBOK guide, organizational culture dimensions are not actually mentioned in the PMBOK guide. So you may not see much in terms of sample exam questions here on the organizational culture dimensions. We have now reached the end of this lesson, so it's time for Justine to say,
I really must be running along.
And I say, until next time.